In this program, we will create a class with a parametrized constructor, and then we will use the class in a main function, and then we will see that we have to provide arguments. Why? Because the constructor is parametrized. So using right, sub bound include string name double GPA and string page. Then in the public area, we write a constructor. The name of the constructor will be the same as the name of the class. No return type. And here we have three parameters. We have string, and we have double G, and we have string M. So here within the constructor's body, we will set the values of the member variables. Okay? Not initialize them. So initialize it when you set them equal to empty string or 0 or like that. Setting the values is when you have parameters in the constructor, and those parameters accept arguments, and those arguments are used to set the values of the member variable. So be very careful. Initialization meaning you do not accept any arguments, there is no parameters. Setting the value means you get the values through the parameters. Arguments are passed down to the parameters, and then they are passed down to the member variables. Okay, so there's a difference. So in this case, we are not initializing the values of the member variables, we are actually setting their values. Okay, we're not initializing, we're just setting their values. So name equal n, and GPA equal G, and major equals M. Okay, so we have 3 lines of code, and we are actually setting the values of the member variables, not initializing them. Now let's say, since we're setting the values of the member variables using the constructor, we don't need to create a set function. So I'll ignore that. I'll ignore the set function here. A set function gives you the ability to change the values of the member variables after an object is created. So after you create an object and you feel the need to change the values of the member variables of that object, you need a set function. If you don't have set function, you lose the ability to change the values after an object is created, right? So here we'll say, okay, we probably don't need that. So we'll just create a get function. So we'll create a string get name, return name, and we have double GPA, and we have string. So we're only writing the get function because for whatever reason we believe we don't need the option of changing the values of the member variables of an object after an object is created, right? Many times that will be handicap, but right now we can live with that. So depends upon the needs of the program. That's all we have. So then we write the main function. Right. Now normally what happens is, if you have a default constructor or you don't write a constructor and you're using the compiler provided constructor, parameter list is empty. Usually the first line of within the main function is like this, student Bob. But if you do that now, compiler will put a red line here. Why? Because compiler is upset that you only have one single parameters constructor, but when you're creating an object of the class student, you are not providing the required arguments. So because there are 3 parameters, 3 arguments are mandatory in this particular case. Okay, So this will be wrong, right? So this thing will be completely wrong. So we can't write this. So here we'll first create three local variables: string name, major, and we'll create one for GPA, and we'll get the information from the user, and then only we can create a. Unless you want a hard code, you can of course do this. If you don't want the values from the user, you could do this: student Bob. First provide the name, then you type the GPA, and then you provide the major, right? Right. So this is okay. Right, this would be okay. Why you are hard coding or you're typing in literal values as arguments, and when this object Bob is created, the constructor executes, and when the constructor executes, this code executes right here. This is the constructor code. So Robert Smith will be passed on to N, 3.2 will be passed on to G, and chemistry will be passed on to M, and through the parameters they will be passed on to the member variables, and the values of the member variables will be set. So in case if you can do that, that is fine, but most of the time in our programs we get this input from the user, so we are not taking this option. We're letting the user decide the values for name, major, and GPA, right? So we'll write cout cns or get lines. So cout, then we have cout. Now because the next one will be using getLine, which is following a cin, we should be careful and put c.ignore. And then put the getLine after this. And getLine. Right, so once these three lines execute, the three local variables name, major, and GPA will get the values. We can then create the, now we can create the object. As arguments, right? So we'll create student Bob, and here we simply provide the three arguments in the exact order as they appear in the parameter list of the constructor. Right, so now when this line executes right here, the object Bob is instantiated, right? Now we can read back, because this line sets the values of the member variables. We can just read it back now. Cout student, name of the student, and that would be Bob dot get name, right? We can't write name here, we have to go through the function get name, and then That's the whole program. Okay. So in this case, because of the fact that our class student only has one constructor, and that constructor happens to be a parametrized constructor, when we create an object of the class student, we have to make sure that we have the arguments to pass to the parameters of the constructor. If we do not pass these arguments, the three required arguments, we will get a compile error and the object will not be created, right? So only way to create an object now is first make sure you have the information uh, either provided by the user or hard coded into this parentheses, and pass this on to the constructor. Otherwise, you cannot create an object of the class student in this particular case. So now we can run this program and see if it works. So the program builds, and now we can provide the three values for name, GPA, and major. So the student's name is Robert Smith. Put the GPA, and the major is say chemistry. Then the cout, final cout gives us the readback. So this is coming from the getName function, Robert Smith. 3.2 is coming from the getGPA function, and chemistry is coming from the getMajor function. So it's a small example which where we see that in case your class only has one parameters constructor, and then you have to provide arguments for object when you make that object. You are allowed to overload. So for example, if we overload, we can create a default and we can create a, so we can go like this. Right, so this is the default constructor. And this is the overloaded parameterized constructor. Because we have two constructors, we are overloading the constructors. You're allowed to overload, so this is overloaded. Constructor. Right, so in this case we decide to overload, and now you get the option of creating the object without providing the value. So now you would be fine if you wrote this. This line will work. So if you write like this, student, say Bill, right, in this case, because we are using creating an object without providing the values for the arguments, compiler will automatically select the default constructor, right? In this case right here, right, in this case compiler constructor will select the parameters constructor, right? So the compiler will decide to select the constructor based on whether you're passing arguments for the object. In this case, because you have a default constructor, this line will be legal now, and the compiler knows you're not passing any arguments, so it's gonna go ahead and create an object Bill. And the problem with that, this particular object, is that since it is using the default constructor, all the member variables are initialized to empty strings or zeros, meaning there's literally nothing in them. So if you try to read back the values of the for the member variables of the object Bill, you will realize everything is coming empty. Why? Because, well, we use the default constructor when we made the object Bill. However, when we read back the values for the object Bob, we can see the values because we use the parameters constructor, and all the member variables have values. So here we're handicapped because we don't have any set functions. If we had set functions, so in this case, if you want to be able to use the default constructor, which means that you will have to create rather input the values for the member variables using set functions after the object is created. So in that case, what will happen is you'll have to go back here and create set functions here so that you can set the values for name, major, and GPA. So here, in the absence of set functions, object bill is empty, meaning the values of the member variables are completely empty. But this line is legal now. Why? Because we are using the default constructor, or a constructor with empty parameter list. In this case, we're using the overloaded parametrized constructor, and we're passing arguments, so all the member variables have values. So it all depends upon what are your requirements in the program, how you want to design your program. So sometimes you will see that programmers will put a default constructor to give themselves the ability to create an object without providing any values for the member variables, and also create a parameters constructor so they can create an object by providing values for the member variables, right? So it all depends upon what exactly is your plan for the program.